I slid into the driver's seat that night, the leather surprisingly warm against my back, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine purred to life, a deep, resonant sound that sent a thrill down my spine. The dashboard flickered on, and a voice emerged from the speakers, not a radio host, but a calm, almost hypnotic tone that said, "Welcome. The journey begins now." The road stretched endlessly before me, slicing through a landscape that seemed to change with every mile. At first, it was ordinary, a highway bordered by fields and occasional clusters of trees. But soon, the world outside the car began to warp. Shadows moved in unnatural ways, the moon seemed to follow me, its light casting grotesque shapes across the windshield. The radio played no music, only faint whispers in a language I couldn't understand. After what felt like hours, I passed a sign that read, "Next exit, Dead Man's Curve." I laughed nervously, the sound brittle and hollow in the confined space of the car. Surely it was a joke, some local quirk to frighten tourists. But as I took the exit, the road twisted sharply, plunging into a dense forest. The air grew colder, frost creeping along the edges of the windshield despite the heater blasting warmth. That's when I saw the figure. It stood in the center of the road, a silhouette against the stark beams of my headlights. A man, or something that resembled one. His head was tilted unnaturally, as though his neck had been broken, and his arms dangled limply at his sides. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest, but when I looked again, the road was empty. The voice returned, louder now. "Keep driving. Do not stop." My heart raced, every instinct screaming to turn around and flee, but my hands remained glued to the wheel. I pressed the gas pedal, and the car surged forward. The road narrowed, trees crowding closer, their branches clawing at the windows like skeletal fingers. Then the smell hit me, an acrid, coppery scent that filled the car and made my stomach churn. I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. The back seat wasn't empty anymore. A girl sat there, her face pale and streaked with tears. She wore a tattered dress, and her eyes, they were black. Not just the pupils, her entire eyes were pools of darkness. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out, only a guttural, choking noise that made my skin crawl. What do you want?" I stammered, my voice trembling. Her lips twisted into a grotesque smile, and she whispered a single word. "Home." Before I could respond, the car jerked violently, as though it had hit something. But the road ahead was clear. I tightened my grip on the wheel, determined not to lose control. The girl was gone, and the radio was silent again, but I could feel her presence lingering, a cold weight pressing against my chest. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed. Time felt meaningless on this cursed road. Then the scenery changed once more. The forest gave way to a barren wasteland, the ground cracked and dry, littered with the bones of animals, and humans. The car seemed to move on its own, the steering wheel unresponsive to my touch. I screamed, begged, and pleaded with the unseen force guiding me, but the only answer was the voice. "You are close now. The end is near." The lights on the dashboard began to flicker, and the engine groaned as if in pain. Then I saw it, a massive gate rising out of the desolation, carved with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The car rolled to a stop before it, and the engine died. I sat there, trembling, unsure whether to stay in the car or step outside. The decision was made for me when the door opened on its own, and an icy wind pulled me out. I stumbled onto the ground, the smell of decay overwhelming, and turned to face the gate. A figure emerged, a tall, shadowy being with no discernible features, only a sense of immense power and malevolence. It pointed a long, spindly finger at me and spoke in a voice that echoed in my mind rather than my ears. "You have arrived." I never thought much about fear on the road. Sure, I've had my share of close calls with distracted drivers and poor weather, but fear, real, bone-deep fear, was something I always associated with shadowy alleyways, creaking floorboards, or the creeping unease of being alone at night. That all changed on one late drive, a stretch of time I can barely comprehend now without shuddering. It began innocuously enough. I had to drive out to a small town 3 hours away to visit my sister. She was moving and needed help packing up her things, and I, as the ever-reliable sibling, offered to help. The plan was simple: leave after work, drive through the evening, and arrive at her place by midnight. I'd crash on her couch, help her pack the next day, and head home by Sunday night. The weather was temperate, the tank was full, and my playlist was queued up. Everything felt normal. The first hour passed uneventfully, the kind of monotonous driving that dulls your senses. Trees blurred into a dark smear on either side of the highway, and the occasional headlights from an oncoming car were the only breaks in the solitude. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, I welcomed it, time to decompress from the stress of work. That peace shattered somewhere around the 90-minute mark. It started with a light. Faint at first, flickering in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was another car. But the light didn't move like headlights, it wavered and bounced, almost like someone carrying a lantern in the distance. I slowed down, glancing back, but the light disappeared as quickly as it had come. Odd, but not alarming. Maybe it was some reflection or a distant house I hadn't noticed. I shrugged it off and kept driving. Another 20 minutes went by before the radio began to crackle. The playlist I'd painstakingly curated was suddenly overtaken by static. I glanced at my phone, but the connection was fine, and the signal bar was full. Annoyed, I toggled the Bluetooth connection on and off. The static persisted, growing louder and more distorted, like a dozen voices speaking over one another in a language I couldn't place. I turned it off. The silence that followed was deafening. That's when I saw him. A man, standing on the shoulder of the road. He was barely illuminated by my headlights, but the flash of his figure was unmistakable. He wore a tattered coat, and his posture was stiff, as though he was frozen mid-step. His face, what little I could make out, was pale, gaunt, and expressionless. I drove past him without slowing down. For a moment, guilt flickered in my mind. What if he was stranded? What if he needed help? But something deeper, more primal, urged me to keep going. I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was gone. The unease stayed with me, crawling up my spine like an icy finger. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he'd been a trick of the light or my imagination playing tricks on me after too long on the road. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The next stretch of road was agonizing. Every shadow seemed to shift, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision set my heart racing. Then, as if on cue, my headlights illuminated another figure. This time, it was a woman. She stood at the center of the road, her long hair obscuring her face. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest. The car came to a halt mere feet from her. My heart pounded as I stared at her motionless figure. She didn't flinch, didn't react to the headlights glaring at her. I rolled down the window slightly, my voice trembling as I called out. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. Something in me screamed to keep driving, to leave her behind. But I couldn't bring myself to move. Against my better judgment, I stepped out of the car, keeping the engine running. "Miss?" I called again. She raised her head slowly, and my breath caught. Her face, it wasn't right. Her features were stretched, distorted as though someone had pulled her skin taut over her skull. Her eyes were empty pits, and her mouth, God, her mouth, was an unnaturally wide grin filled with teeth that didn't belong. I stumbled backward, my legs nearly giving out beneath me. Before I could react further, she moved. Not toward me, but straight down. One moment she was there, and the next, she collapsed into the ground as though swallowed whole. I scrambled back into the car and floored it. The road seemed endless after that. I drove faster than I ever had, white-knuckling the wheel, my eyes darting to every shadow, every movement. The trees pressed closer to the road, their gnarled branches clawing at the night sky like skeletal hands. I was so focused on what might be outside that I didn't notice the noise at first. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the back seat. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes on the road, to pretend I didn't hear it. But fear has a way of overriding logic. My gaze flicked to the rearview mirror. There was nothing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like knuckles against glass. Slowly, my eyes shifted to the passenger side window. A face was pressed against the glass, upside down, staring at me. The features were blurred, almost fluid, as though they were melting. The eyes were impossibly wide, and the mouth moved soundlessly. I swerved instinctively, nearly losing control of the car. When I looked again, the face was gone. I don't know how long I drove like that, trembling, my chest tight with terror. The road seemed to stretch on forever, looping endlessly through the dark. The GPS had stopped working entirely, the screen frozen on an error message. Eventually, I saw a light up ahead. A gas station. Relief flooded me as I pulled into the lot. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows over the cracked pavement. The place was empty, but it didn't matter. I needed to catch my breath, to collect myself. I stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling weakly. The clerk, a wiry man with a weathered face, looked up from his magazine. "Late night?" he asked casually. "You could say that," I muttered, grabbing a bottle of water and placing it on the counter. As he rang me up, I couldn't help but glance at the window. My car sat in the lot, bathed in the harsh light. Something moved in the back seat. "Hey," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Did you see anyone else pull in?" The clerk raised an eyebrow. "Nope. Just you." I turned back to the window. The movement had stopped. When I finally got back on the road, I told myself it was just exhaustion. Maybe I'd been driving too long, and my mind was playing tricks on me. That's what I kept telling myself, even as the tapping started again. Even as the headlights began to flicker. Even as the road ahead dissolved into darkness, and I realized I'd been driving in circles. I never made it to my sister's house. To this day, I don't know what happened that night. The memories come in fragments, lights, faces, whispers in the static. But the fear, that bone-deep, paralyzing fear, has never left me. The car sits in my driveway now, collecting dust. I can't bring myself to sell it, but I'll never drive it again. And sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping on the windows. It started like any other late-night drive. The kind you take when the road stretches out endlessly before you, illuminated by nothing but the glow of your headlights and the faint shimmer of stars above. I'd taken plenty of these trips before, through quiet highways and lonely country roads, the hum of my car's engine my only companion. But this time was different. This time, the road seemed alive. I was heading home from a work retreat, a 2-day borefest of team-building exercises and half-hearted motivational speeches. We'd wrapped up late, and though my colleagues opted to stay another night at the lodge, I wanted nothing more than to be in my own bed. So I packed my things, waved goodbye, and hit the road. The first hour was uneventful. My playlist churned out familiar tunes, and I sang along to keep myself awake. The occasional car passed by, their headlights momentarily piercing the darkness before disappearing into the void. The world was quiet, almost too quiet, but I told myself that was normal for this stretch of highway. Around the second hour, the unease began to creep in. It started subtly, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow darting across the edge of my headlights, too quick to register but unmistakably there. At first, I chalked it up to fatigue. Long drives can mess with your head, and I'd been staring at the road for what felt like forever. I adjusted the air conditioning, hoping the blast of cold air would snap me out of it, and kept driving. But the shadows didn't stop. Every few minutes, I'd catch another fleeting glimpse. A dark shape slinking along the roadside or a figure standing just beyond the reach of my lights. When I looked directly, there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of pavement and the black abyss of the trees lining the highway. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, and I turned the music up, hoping to drown out the growing sense of dread. And then I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, illuminated briefly by my high beams. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, wearing a white dress that billowed slightly in the night breeze. Her face was obscured by her hair, and she held one arm outstretched as though signaling for me to stop. For a split second, I considered pulling over. But something about her posture, her stillness, sent a shiver down my spine. I drove past her without slowing. My heart pounded as I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was gone. Not walking away, not fading into the distance, just gone. Like she'd never been there at all. I told myself I'd imagined it. A trick of the light or a product of my overworked brain. But deep down, I knew better. The road ahead seemed different after that. The trees pressed closer, their branches arching over the highway like skeletal fingers. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and the faint hum of the engine felt deafening in the silence. I tried to focus on the road, but my eyes kept darting to the mirrors, searching for something, anything, that might be lurking behind me. That's when the radio started acting up. The music cut out mid-song, replaced by a low, crackling static. I fiddled with the dials, hoping to find another station, but the noise persisted, growing louder with each passing second. And beneath it, faint but distinct, I heard something else. A voice. It was faint at first, a whisper buried in the static. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. My stomach churned as I turned the radio off completely, plunging the car into an eerie, suffocating silence. But even with the radio off, I swore I could still hear it. The whispering. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, my speed creeping well past the limit. The road blurred beneath me, but no matter how fast I went, the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. And then, just as my grip on reality felt like it was slipping, I saw another figure. This time, it was a man. He stood in the center of the road, his back to me, dressed in a dark suit that looked impossibly out of place. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. My heart raced as I stared at the man, waiting for him to move, to acknowledge my presence. But he didn't. He just stood there, motionless. I honked the horn, the sound piercing the stillness like a gunshot. Still, he didn't react. My hands trembled as I debated what to do. Drive around him? Get out and confront him? Every option felt like a terrible idea, but I couldn't sit there forever. Before I could decide, he turned. I'll never forget his face. It was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were black voids, empty and unblinking. His mouth curled into a twisted grin, revealing teeth that were jagged and too many. He took a step toward the car, and my body moved on instinct. I slammed the car into reverse, the engine roaring as I sped backward down the highway. When I finally regained control and shifted back into drive, he was gone. I didn't stop again. The rest of the drive was a blur. The shadows grew darker, the air colder, and the whispers louder. My headlights flickered occasionally, plunging the road into brief moments of total darkness that felt like hours. I kept my foot on the gas, my eyes fixed on the horizon, praying for a sign of civilization. When I finally saw the lights of a small diner up ahead, I nearly cried with relief. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting a soft glow over the parking lot. I pulled in, my hands shaking as I turned off the engine. The world felt eerily quiet as I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin. Inside, the diner was almost empty. A tired-looking waitress stood behind the counter, her gaze flicking to me as I entered. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice flat but not unkind. "You have no idea," I muttered, sliding into a booth near the window. I ordered a coffee, hoping the warmth would steady my nerves, and stared out at the car. It sat there, still and silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was inside. When the coffee arrived, I asked the waitress about the road. "That stretch of highway, has anyone ever mentioned anything weird about it?" Her expression darkened, and for a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something. But instead, she just shook her head. "You're not the first to ask," she said quietly. "And you won't be the last." I didn't press her for details. Part of me didn't want to know. When I finally left the diner, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The road ahead seemed less ominous in the growing daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened that night. I haven't taken another late-night drive since, and every time I pass that stretch of highway, my chest tightens with an unshakable sense of dread. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the world is still, I hear whispers. Faint and distant, like a voice carried on the wind. And in those moments, I remember the road, the shadows, the faces, and the endless, suffocating darkness.